Michigan 2008. A cold case finally solved. Natalie Ann Marquette, a 30-year-old bakery owner, was a beloved figure in her lakeside town. Known for her warm laugh and morning pastries, Natalie vanished one September evening without a trace. Her car was found abandoned on a quiet rural road, keys still in the ignition, a single trail of footprints leading into the woods. Despite exhaustive searches mounting community pressure and even whispers of misconduct within the department, the case went cold. For years there were no answers, only heartbreak. But now, over a decade later, a stunning DNA breakthrough and a shocking arrest have brought the truth to light. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country in the time right now. In the heart of a small Michigan town bordered by Lake Huron's calm blue waters, there was a bakery where the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread drifted through the streets before the sun had fully risen. The bakery was called Sweet June's, and it was run by a woman whose presence warmed the town just as much as her pastries did. Natalie Ann Marquette was 30 years old, with soft eyes that crinkled when she smiled, and a laugh that customers often said lingered like sunshine. The bakery, named after her late mother, was her pride and legacy. Each morning, the bell above the door chimed with regulars, teachers, truck drivers, high schoolers, and retirees, greeted by the familiar sight of Natalie in her flour-dusted apron, her hair pulled back, a mug of black coffee in hand. Natalie wasn't just a business owner. She was a fixture of the community. She knew birthdays, allergies, and how to spot when someone needed a free muffin and a quiet conversation more than anything else. Her impact rippled out quietly, delivering cookies to nursing homes, sponsoring bake sales, slipping bread to the unemployed without charge. She lived in a modest two-bedroom house with her elderly father, Harold, a retired electrician whose health had declined in recent years. Her younger brother, Evan, lived nearby and often helped with deliveries and repairs around the bakery. After their mother's death from cancer, Natalie had become the emotional glue in the family, balancing grief with resilience, mourning with motion. To the outside world, she appeared fulfilled. She'd never married, but not from lack of interest. She'd once dated a man from Alpena, but it hadn't lasted. Rumors said she preferred the simplicity of small-town life over the entanglements of complicated relationships. She often joked, "My heart's already full with coffee, dough, and the people who walk through that door." Locals recall Natalie as someone who lit up early mornings. Her hands always moved, kneading, frosting, folding, but her attention was sharp. If someone cried in her shop, she offered space. If someone laughed, she amplified it. She had become in many ways the beating heart of the town. There were no signs of trouble, no rumors, no fear in her eyes. Her schedule was a rhythm everyone came to count on. The lights at Sweet June's flicked on at 4:30 a.m. The last tray pulled from the oven by 9, and the doors closed around 3 p.m. After that, she'd visit her father, walk along the lake, or attend local fundraisers. It was a peaceful loop, but it's often in the stillness that the first crack appears, silent, unnoticed. One friend would later remember a strange moment, weeks before Natalie disappeared. Natalie paused mid-laugh at a birthday party, glancing over her shoulder as if she felt watched, but she quickly brushed it off, claiming she was just tired. No one imagined anything sinister. In towns like this, where people leave their doors unlocked and their hearts open, it's easy to forget that danger doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it waits in the quiet, slipping between the seconds of daily life. That September, Natalie baked her last batch of cinnamon rolls, wiped down the counter, and turned the sign to closed. No one knew it would be the last time they'd see her. What could possibly tear someone like Natalie from a life so full of purpose and love? Thursday, September 11th, 2008, began like any other day in the town of Marquette. The morning air was cool and crisp, with a hint of fall threading through the late summer breeze. Natalie Marquette arrived at Sweet June's early, as usual. By 6 a.m., the ovens were on, and the first batch of cinnamon rolls was rising. Customers trickled in, offering their usual greetings, smiles, and stories. But something was different. Natalie seemed preoccupied, not distraught, just quiet. A few noticed it. She smiled, but it didn't linger. She moved through her tasks like someone watching the clock. Around 1:30 p.m., she told a regular customer, a retired teacher named Mrs. Crowley, that she had to run an errand and would be closing up early. She didn't offer more. Natalie locked up the shop by 2:00 p.m. earlier than usual. That was the last time anyone reported seeing her. By evening, Natalie's phone went unanswered. Her brother Evan sent her a text, no reply. Her father called around 6 p.m., nothing. It wasn't like her to disappear even for a few hours. By 9 p.m., Evan was driving through town, checking her usual haunts. The grocery store, the lakefront, a friend's house. No sign of her. At 6:45 the next morning, a county deputy responding to a passerby's report found Natalie's white Honda Civic pulled off a desolate stretch of gravel road about 10 miles outside town. The road, known to locals as Clearview Trail, wound through dense forest and wasn't a typical route for anyone heading anywhere. The car's engine was cold. The driver's door was ajar. Natalie's purse sat on the passenger seat, her wallet still inside, untouched. Her phone was gone. So were her keys. And then there were the footprints. A single pair of prints led from the driver's side of the car into the woods. They stopped about 50 yards in, abruptly. No return path. No signs of a struggle, as if she had simply vanished. Within hours, law enforcement cordoned off the area. Drones and helicopters scanned the forest canopy. K-9 units scoured the underbrush. Volunteers combed the woods shoulder to shoulder. Flashlights cut through the dusk. The town came together with a determination fueled by disbelief. But as night fell again, they had nothing. No clothing. No broken branches. No cries for help. Just silence and the lingering echo of Natalie's absence. The town turned frantic. Flyers with Natalie's photo appeared on shop windows, telephone poles, and church bulletin boards. The image, a candid shot of her behind the bakery counter, smiling and flower-streaked, became burned into the community's collective consciousness. Local businesses offered rewards. The town organized vigils. News crews began arriving. For the first time in years, national attention focused on Marquette, but not for reasons anyone wanted. And then came the rumors. Some whispered she'd run away, that maybe she'd grown tired of the small-town life. Others speculated about secret relationships, debts, or threats. A few claimed to have seen a man in a dark hoodie watching the bakery days before. But there were no facts. Just fragments and fear. Police assured the public they were following all leads. But days passed, then weeks, and the search began to feel more like a ritual than a rescue. The bakery remained closed, the windows dark. A vase of wilting sunflowers sat by the door. Sweet Junes, once the heart of the community, was now a haunting reminder of what had been lost. Natalie Marquette, the woman who had touched so many lives, had simply disappeared. What did investigators uncover in those early frantic days, and why did it all lead nowhere? 14 days after Natalie Marquette vanished, the town of Marquette was holding its breath, clinging to fading hope. Search teams had scaled back, leads had slowed, and then a grim breakthrough came from someone who wasn't even looking for her. On the morning of September 25th, a bow hunter trekking through a remote stretch of the Huron National Forest noticed an odd mound beneath a layer of dead leaves and moss. Curious, he stepped closer, nudging at it with his boot. What he uncovered would shatter the town. Beneath the shallow covering was a woman's body, bruised, bound, and lifeless. Authorities were called immediately. Within hours, a perimeter was established. Crime scene tape draped through the trees, and investigators swarmed the secluded area. The site was located over 30 miles from where Natalie's car had been discovered, deep enough into the woods to require off-road vehicles and GPS coordination to access. The victim was soon identified, Natalie Ann Marquette. The details were devastating. Her wrists were tied behind her back with coarse rope. Her throat showed signs of manual strangulation. Her clothing was disheveled, though the coroner later stated there was no clear indication of sexual assault. The autopsy revealed defensive wounds on her arms and hands, bruises and lacerations suggesting she fought back. She had been dead for nearly the entire time she'd been missing. The community's anguish, which had hovered in the air for weeks, now cracked open. Candlelight vigils, once filled with hope, transformed into tear-streaked memorials. The bakery door, once propped open by a basket of fresh scones, remained shut, now covered in photos, flowers, and handwritten messages. Natalie's father collapsed upon hearing the news, overcome with grief and the cruel finality of it all. Her brother Evan retreated from public view entirely. Friends said he barely spoke for days. Despite the emotional devastation, the discovery ignited a new surge of investigative effort. Forensic teams spent days combing the burial site. Soil samples were taken. Fibers and hairs were collected. Trace evidence from the ropes was preserved. Swabs were taken from under Natalie's fingernails. If there had been a struggle, they hoped she might have left behind her attacker's DNA. Yet strangely, there were no signs of a struggle near the burial site itself. No dragged footprints, no broken branches. It was as if Natalie had been transported there after death and placed with care, not hastily dumped, but arranged. A shallow grave hidden but not deeply concealed. This detail haunted the lead investigators. The calculated nature of it suggested premeditation or at least experience. Whoever did this didn't panic. They took their time. Natalie's toxicology report came back clean. No alcohol. No sedatives. This wasn't a case of impaired judgment or an accidental encounter gone wrong. This was controlled, deliberate violence. The killer had the strength and the will to silence her, and the knowledge to leave behind almost nothing. But the police weren't empty-handed. They had physical evidence now. The rope, the soil, the fibers, the samples under her nails. They had a time of death. They had a body. The question was, would it be enough? In an age where DNA was solving decades-old cases across the country, Marquette's residents believed justice was within reach. But as days turned into weeks with no arrests, that hope began to dim again. Natalie's photo remained on bulletin boards in candle-lit shrines. Her name was spoken in past tense, and for the first time the town began to fear something worse than disappearance: impunity. The question shifted from where to who, and most haunting of all, why hadn't the killer been caught? With physical evidence in hand, why couldn't the police close in on a suspect? From the moment Natalie's body was recovered, detectives poured into the case with urgency. Local homicide units, aided by state investigators, set up a command post in a municipal building and began methodical interviews. They spoke to everyone close to Natalie: ex-boyfriends, friends, suppliers, employees, and the occasional stranger who remembered a face in the bakery. Dozens of interviews were conducted. Some individuals were asked to submit to polygraph exams. Warrants were sought and executed for residences, vehicles, and electronic records. Evidence logs grew long. Paperwork proliferated. The sense of momentum was real, but so were the obstacles. One early person of interest was a delivery driver who had been seen arguing with Natalie over a late shipment of baking supplies. He was detained for questioning, his statements scrutinized for inconsistency. When investigators verified timestamps, receipts, and multiple independent witnesses, his alibi held. Another lead emerged from a woman who claimed Natalie had been followed home by an unknown man and had confided in her about feeling uneasy. Investigators canvassed neighborhoods, searched surveillance footage, and re-interviewed friends. The sighting could not be substantiated. At the burial site, forensic teams documented a partial boot print impressed in soft soil near the shallow grave. Specialists photographed and cast the print, but the pattern was incomplete, worn by weather and time. Local shoe manufacturers and retailers were consulted. The print returned no matches in national databases. Aside from that, physical evidence remained frustratingly sparse. Hair fibers, trace cloth fibers, and a few degraded cellular samples that initially resisted profiling. As inquiries broadened, tensions surfaced. Detectives from competing jurisdictions clashed over control of the investigation. Paper trails were misfiled. Chain of custody logs showed gaps. Items labeled for analysis were misplaced in storage. In small towns where resources are limited and relationships intertwined, procedural missteps can have oversized consequences. Rumors, some grounded, some speculative, swirled through the community. Whispers about mishandled evidence and bureaucratic bickering fed fervent online discussion and fueled distrust. Community trust, once robust, began to erode. Town meetings grew heated. Questions aimed at police leadership multiplied. Was the evidence properly logged? Were all leads being pursued? Critics pointed to delays in forensic testing and the lack of clear updates. Family members demanded transparency. Natalie's father retreated from public life, slamming doors on reporters. Her brother Evan, wounded by grief and disillusionment, left town to stay with a friend out of state. Investigative momentum slowed. Leads that might have been fresh deteriorated with time. Witness memories blurred. Possible suspects moved away or died. Forensic samples languished in lab queues, delayed by backlogs and limited funding. What began as a highly visible hunt tapered into a slower paperwork-driven slog through files, subpoenas, and follow-ups that yielded little. The case shifted from frantic fieldwork to an archivist's task, sorting, recataloguing, hoping a missed note might become relevant. Yet even amid apparent negligence or ordinary human error, some asked a harsher question. Had someone deliberately impeded the probe? Had relationships and small-town loyalties created blind spots that protected a suspect? In communities where former acquaintances become jurors, employers, or in-law relations, conflicts of interest are an ever-present threat. Internal reviews were promised. Meetings were held. A few officers were reassigned. But public reassurances rarely erased the sting of delay. Detectives grew weary. Small victories were suffocated by administrative delays. A dedicated cold case advocate from a neighboring county volunteered to review files, finding inconsistencies that begged for re-examination. Grassroots investigators, neighbors, retired officers, and true crime bloggers kept the story alive online, pushing for renewed testing and public accountability. Yet for every new voice, the official record remained stubbornly unmoving. The investigation, for all its early energy, staggered in the months that followed. The town's grief hardened into skepticism. Vigil candles burned alongside accusations. Friends who had once expected swift justice now kept their distance, fearful of being drawn into an expensive, exhausting fight for answers. What caused the case to slip through the cracks, and was someone truly intentionally burying the truth? By the summer of 2010, just 2 years after Natalie Marquette's murder, shocked the quiet community of Marquette, Michigan. The once urgent investigation had drifted into a numbing stillness. The yellowed flyers once plastered to storefronts and telephone poles had peeled away. Her smiling face, once a rallying symbol for justice, became an uncomfortable memory. People stopped asking questions. The momentum was gone. The bakery, Sweet June's, sat vacant for months before being sold to a new owner who remodeled it and changed the name. The comforting smell of cinnamon rolls no longer drifted down the street each morning. That chapter had closed. Natalie's absence became something people lived with, like a permanent shadow cast across the town square. The police department quietly transferred the Marquette file to the cold case unit, a section that existed more for optics than action, with limited funding and a small team. The case slipped into an abyss of manila folders, unprocessed evidence kits, and fading interest. Officers who had once pounded pavement for leads were reassigned, promoted, or retired. The energy was gone. The urgency faded into procedural limbo. Natalie's father, Harold, never recovered from the loss of his only daughter. His health declined steadily. In 2013, he passed away after a short illness. At the funeral, Evan Marquette stood beside his father's casket and delivered a brief, heartbreaking eulogy. "They took her," he said to a silent congregation, "and they got away with it." The words lingered in the air, unresolved and bitter. Afterward, Evan packed what remained of his family's life and left Marquette. Some said he moved out west. Others claimed he wanted to forget. But forgetting was never really an option. Not when justice had never been served. Natalie's case became a ghost story of sorts. It lived on in Reddit threads, true crime podcasts, and midnight AM radio shows. Her story was passed from one curious listener to another, often bundled with conspiracy theories and amateur sleuth speculation. Yet in Marquette, people stopped speaking her name aloud, not out of disrespect, but out of helplessness. It hurt too much to remember how much she'd meant and how little had come from her loss. The burial site in Huron National Forest grew wild again. The forest, indifferent to human tragedy, reclaimed the soil where Natalie's body had been found. The path that had once been cordoned off by police tape was now overgrown, indistinguishable from the rest of the dense Michigan woods. For nearly a decade, the case gathered dust. The few lingering suspects identified in the early investigation had faded from attention. One had moved out of state. Another had passed away. Background checks were no longer run, tips no longer chased, evidence no longer reanalyzed. The boot print, the rope, the fingernail samples, they sat in storage untouched. And yet the truth has a strange persistence. Even in silence, it waits. Evidence does not vanish simply because it's forgotten. It waits for science to catch up, for curiosity to return, for someone new to care. In 2018, the Michigan State Police applied for a federal grant to process cold case DNA evidence using updated forensic technology. Natalie's file was listed almost as an afterthought among dozens of others.
Average build, white male, maybe in his 40s or 50s, could have been anyone. Ortega ran the description through databases, cross-referenced it with known offenders in the area, checked for any similar reports from 2013. Nothing matched. She returned to Canyon Creek, walked the trail Harrow described, found the fallen cedar tree. It was still there, rotting into the earth, moss thick along its trunk. She stood in that spot and tried to imagine what Harrow had seen. A young woman and an older man walking together. Had Maury known him? Was she in danger? Or had Harrow's drug-addled memory invented a narrative that didn't exist? The lead went nowhere, without a clear identification, without any corroborating evidence. Harrow's account was just another unverifiable story. Ortega filed the report and moved on, but the image stayed with her. A man in a khaki jacket standing too close, looking over his shoulder. Guilty behavior, or just caution, she couldn't be sure. By 2018, Maury's case had been cold for 5 years. The Facebook page Linda maintained had slowed to occasional posts, birthday tributes, anniversary remembrances. The comment sections were filled with well-meaning strangers offering prayers and theories. Armchair detectives convinced they'd crack the mystery if only someone would listen. Ortega read through them sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep. Most were nonsense, wild speculation about underground trafficking rings or cult activity in the forest. But every once in a while, someone would post a detail that made her pause. A hiker who'd seen something strange near Bear Creek. A camper who'd found an old notebook buried under leaves. A ranger who remembered a man asking questions about a missing girl in 2014, then disappearing before anyone could get his name. The problem with cold cases was that time distorted memory. Witnesses forgot details or invented new ones. Evidence degraded. Trails went cold literally and figuratively. Ortega knew the statistics. If a missing person wasn't found within the first 72 hours, the chances of finding them alive dropped to nearly zero. If they weren't found out within a year, most cases remained unsolved forever. Maury Kelly was approaching 6 years missing. The forest had reclaimed whatever it had taken. But in the spring of 2019, something shifted. A young detective named Marcus Lowe joined the Skamania County Sheriff's Office, fresh from a specialized training program in forensic genealogy and cold case resolution. He'd heard about Maury's case during his orientation and asked Ortega if he could review the file. She handed it over without hesitation, grateful someone else cared enough to look. Lowe spent weeks immersed in the evidence. He digitized everything, built a timeline, created a geographical profile of Maury's movements. He noticed something Ortega had missed. The phone case had been found near a fault line, an area prone to small landslides and soil displacement. What if it hadn't been carried there by a person? What if water or shifting earth had moved it over time? Lowe consulted with geologists, studied erosion patterns, analyzed rainfall data from 2013 to 2014. His theory was plausible. A heavy winter storm could have dislodged the case from its original location and carried it downstream through underground water channels. If that was true, it meant Maury's body might be buried somewhere near the original search zone, hidden beneath layers of sediment and forest debris. Ortega was skeptical but willing to try anything. In June of 2019, they organized a new search focusing on areas with significant erosion or recent landslides. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs trained to detect remains buried deep underground, and a team of forensic archaeologists. The search lasted 2 weeks. They covered miles of terrain, scanned creek beds, excavated suspicious sites. They found animal bones, old camping gear, remnants of illegal fire pits, but no sign of Maury. On the final day, one of the cadaver dogs alerted near a collapsed embankment along the South Fork of Canyon Creek. The team carefully excavated the area, removing layers of soil and rock. 6 feet down, they found fabric, gray, faded, decomposed. It was buried alongside fragments of bone, small pieces that might have been human. The forensic team collected everything and sent it to the state crime lab in Olympia for analysis. Ortega called Linda Kelly that evening. She chose her words carefully. "We may have found something. We're waiting on confirmation. Please don't get your hopes up yet. But Linda had been waiting 6 years for this phone call. Hope was all she had left. The bones arrived at the Washington State Crime Lab on a Tuesday morning in late June 2019. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Elena Vasquez had seen hundreds of cases like this. Remains, recovered from wilderness areas, degraded by time and elements, often too fragmented to yield definitive answers. But she treated each set of bones with the same careful reverence, knowing that somewhere a family was waiting. Counting hours, bargaining with hope. The fragments recovered from the embankment were small, badly decomposed, mixed with soil and organic matter. Dr. Vasquez laid them out on a sterile examination table under bright lights and began the painstaking process of analysis. The fabric was examined first. Gray cotton blend, consistent with hoodie material. Though so deteriorated it was nearly impossible to confirm a match with the hoodie found in 2013. There were no visible labels, no identifying marks, just threads holding on to the memory of what they once were. The bone fragments were more promising. Dr. Vasquez identified portions of a radius, a femur, several small bones that could have been from a hand or foot, all human, all belonging to a single individual. The size and density suggested a young adult, likely female. Dental records would provide confirmation, but those required more intact remains. What they had were pieces of a person, not yet a name. DNA extraction was the next step. Dr. Vasquez sent samples to the lab's molecular biology unit, where technicians worked to isolate genetic material from the bone marrow. Degradation was severe. The bones had been exposed to moisture, temperature fluctuations, microbial activity. But modern forensic techniques had advanced significantly in recent years. Using a process called whole genome amplification, the lab was able to extract a partial DNA profile. It wasn't complete, but it was enough to run through databases and compare against known references. Linda Kelly had provided a DNA sample years earlier, stored in the National Missing Persons Registry. The comparison took 3 days. On July 2, 2019, Dr. Vasquez called Detective Ortega with the results. The DNA was a match. The remains belonged to Maury Kelly. Ortega closed her office door, sat down heavily in her chair, and allowed herself a moment of silence. After 6 years, they had found her. Not alive, not the miracle Linda had prayed for, but found nonetheless. The confirmation brought a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief that the searching was over, grief that it had ended this way. Ortega called Linda Kelly that afternoon. She drove to Spokane herself, couldn't bear to deliver the news over the phone. Linda answered the door already crying, as if she'd known the moment she saw Ortega's car pull into the driveway. They sat together in the living room, surrounded by photos of Maury, and Ortega spoke the words every detective dreads. "We found her. I'm so sorry." Robert Kelly was called next. He drove from his house to Linda's in silence, hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. When he arrived, Linda was sitting on the porch, staring at nothing. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They sat together as the sun set. Two people who had spent 6 years suspended between hope and despair, finally released into the certainty of loss. The next morning, Ortega returned to Canyon Creek with a full forensic team. Now that they knew where Maury had been found, the excavation expanded. They carefully sifted through every inch of soil around the collapsed site, searching for additional remains, personal effects, anything that might explain what had happened. Over the course of a week, they recovered more bone fragments, enough to confirm that most of Maury's skeleton had remained in that location. They also found remnants of her clothing, pieces of a shoe, and buried 18 inches deeper than the bones. Something unexpected. A small waterproof pouch, the kind hikers use to protect valuables from moisture. Inside, the pouch was a notebook, Maury's notebook, the one witnesses had seen her writing in the night before she disappeared. The pages were damp but intact, protected by the waterproof seal. Detective Lowe carefully opened it, turning each page with gloved hands. The entries were dated, starting from earlier in the summer of 2013. Most were mundane observations about nature, sketches of plants and animals, reflections on solitude and silence. But the final entries, written during her time at Canyon Creek Campground, told a different story. They read, August 16th, 2013. Arrived at the campground around 3, set up the tent. Everything feels perfect here. Quiet, peaceful. Saw a man watching me from across the campground earlier, but he left before I could say hello. Probably just another camper. August 17th. Woke up early and hiked the main trail. Ran into the same man from yesterday. He was standing off the path, not hiking, just standing. He smiled when I passed, but didn't say anything. Something about it felt off. I kept walking. Came back to camp and he was sitting at the picnic table next to my site. He said his name was David, said he camps here every summer. Asked if I was alone. I told him I was meeting friends tomorrow, which isn't true. I don't know why I lied. He made me uncomfortable. The entry for August 18th, the day Maury disappeared, was longer and more frantic. The handwriting grew less controlled as the entry progressed. August 18th. He's still here. David. I saw him again this morning standing near the trailhead. I decided to hike anyway. Thought maybe I was being paranoid. He followed me, not close, but I could see him behind me every time I looked back. I walked faster. He stayed the same distance away like he was pacing me. I turned off the main trail, tried to lose him in the trees. I thought it worked. I stopped hearing footsteps, but then I saw him again, ahead of me this time, just standing there like he'd been waiting. I asked him what he wanted. He said he just wanted to talk. He said the forest was dangerous for a girl alone. He said he could keep me safe. I told him to leave me alone. I tried to walk past him, but he grabbed my arm, not hard, but firm. I pulled away and ran. I don't know where I am now. I'm off trail. I can hear the creek, but I can't see it. I'm going to wait here until it gets dark, then try to make it back to camp. I should have listened to my instincts. I should have left yesterday. If anyone finds this, his name is David. Khaki jacket. Blue baseball cap. Drives a white truck. Older model. I saw it parked near the ranger station. Please find me. That was the last entry. The notebook had been sealed in the pouch buried with her body or hidden nearby before she died. Either Maury had tried to leave evidence behind, or the earth had simply swallowed it along with everything else. But now they had a name, David, a description, a vehicle. Detective Ortega felt the case crack open in her hands. This was no longer a mystery about a girl who wandered off and got lost. This was a predator. This was murder. The investigation shifted immediately. Ortega and Lowe pulled the records from the Canyon Creek campground for August 2013, looking for anyone named David who had checked in that weekend. The ranger station kept logs, but they were incomplete. Many campers paid cash and never signed in properly. They expanded. The search, looking for white trucks, registered to men named David in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Thousands of names came back. They cross-referenced with criminal records focusing on anyone with a history of violence, stalking, or assault. The list narrowed to 47 individuals. One name stood out. David Gene Kelmer, 52 years old, registered. Address in Stevenson, Washington, less than 30 miles from Canyon Creek campground. Kelmer had a record. In 1998, he'd been charged with assault after a confrontation with a female hiker near Dog Mountain. The charges were dropped when the victim moved out of state and declined to testify. In 2005, he'd been investigated for harassment after multiple women reported being followed on trails near the Columbia River Gorge. No charges filed. In 2011, a restraining order had been issued by a woman in Hood River, Oregon, claiming Kelmer had showed up at her home uninvited after meeting her on a hiking trail. The order expired after 2 years. Kelmer was known to local rangers as someone who spent excessive time in national forests, often camping alone for weeks. He worked sporadically as a handyman, had no permanent address, lived out of his truck most of the year, a white 1987 Ford F-150. Ortega ran Kelmer's photo through a facial recognition database and compared it to the sketch Vincent Harrow had helped create in 2017. The resemblance was strong, not perfect, but close enough. She contacted the Washington State Patrol and requested a welfare check on Kelmer's last known location. Officers found him 3 days later, camped illegally near Panther Creek, less than 15 miles from where Maury's remains had been discovered. When approached, Kelmer was calm, almost friendly. He said he'd been expecting someone to come eventually. He didn't resist. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He just smiled and said, "Took you long enough." Kelmer was taken into custody on July 12th, 2019, and transported to the Skamania County Jail. Ortega conducted the first interview the following morning. Kelmer sat across from her in the interrogation room, hands folded on the table, expression unreadable. He was tall, thin, weathered by years outdoors. His eyes were pale blue, calm, almost serene. Ortega placed Maury's photo on the table between them and asked if he recognized her. Kelmer looked at the photo for a long time, then nodded slowly. He said he remembered her. Said she'd been at Canyon Creek that August. Said they'd talked a few times. Said she'd been friendly at first, then cold, then rude. He claimed he'd only been trying to help her. Warned her about the dangers of hiking alone. He said she'd overreacted. Accused him of following her when he'd just been walking the same trails. He denied ever touching her, denied ever threatening her. But when Ortega mentioned the notebook, Kelmer's expression changed, just for a moment. A flicker of something, fear maybe, or recognition that his story was falling apart. Ortega read aloud from Maury's final entry, the description of the khaki jacket, the blue baseball cap, the white truck. Kelmer's face remained neutral, but his hands clenched slightly. Ortega asked him directly, "Did you kill Maury Kelly?" Kelmer leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. For nearly a minute, he said nothing. Then quietly, almost as if talking to himself, he said, "She shouldn't have run. I told her the forest was dangerous. I told her I could keep her safe, but she ran anyway. It wasn't a confession, not legally, but it was enough." Ortega terminated the interview and contacted the prosecutor's office. David Gene Kelmer was formally charged with second-degree murder, kidnapping, and unlawful imprisonment. His bail was denied. The trial was set for early 2020, and for the first time in 6 years, Linda and Robert Kelly allowed themselves to believe that justice might finally come for their daughter. The arrest of David Gene Kelmer sent shockwaves through the Pacific Northwest hiking community. Within hours of the news breaking, online forums exploded with stories from women who claimed they'd encountered him on trails over the years. A woman from Portland remembered a man in a khaki jacket who'd followed her for 2 miles near Eagle Creek in 2009, always staying just far enough behind that she couldn't confront him. Another hiker from Bellingham described being approached by someone matching Kelmer's description at a remote campsite in 2015, offering unsolicited advice about bears and asking intrusive questions about whether she was traveling alone. A jogger in the Columbia River Gorge recalled a white pickup truck that had slowly followed her along a Forest Service road in 2012, the driver watching her through the window, never speeding up or passing. None of these women had reported the incidents at the time. They'd dismissed their discomfort as paranoia, convinced themselves they were overreacting. Now they understood they'd been in danger. Detective Ortega and Detective Lowe began the painstaking process of connecting these reports to Kelmer's movements. They subpoenaed his employment records, sparse as they were. Kelmer had worked odd jobs across 3 states over 2 decades, never staying anywhere long. A week here fixing fences on a ranch near Bend, a month there repairing roofs in Packwood. Between jobs, he vanished into the forests, sometimes for months at a time. They tracked his vehicle registrations, found he'd owned the same white Ford F-150R since 1995, had let the registration lapse multiple times, accumulated dozens of parking tickets at trailheads and campgrounds. He was a ghost who lived in plain sight, drifting through the wilderness, watching. In August 2019, forensic teams executed a search warrant on Kelmer's truck, which had been impounded after his arrest. The vehicle was a disaster, cluttered with camping gear, empty food containers, and stacks of handwritten journals. The journals were disturbing. Page after page of observations about women he'd seen on trails, detailed descriptions of their clothing, their habits, where they camped, whether they were alone. Some entries included crude sketches, side profiles, backs of heads. Others contained angry rants about women who'd ignored him or told him to leave them alone, calling them rude, ungrateful, asking for trouble. One entry from July 2013 read, "Saw a girl today at Canyon Creek. Dark hair, college age, hiking alone, too confident. Doesn't understand how vulnerable she is. Someone should teach her." The entry was dated 3 weeks before Maury disappeared. Forensic analysts processed the truck for physical evidence. They found hair samples, fiber evidence, and soil consistent with the area where Maury's remains had been discovered. They also found something more damning. Hidden beneath the passenger seat, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, was a silver necklace with a small turquoise pendant. Linda Kelly identified it immediately from a photo. Maury had worn that necklace every day since her 16th birthday. It had been a gift from her grandmother. The discovery was devastating and clarifying. Kelmer had kept it as a trophy. The prosecutor's office, led by Deputy District Attorney Rachel Nguyen, built the case methodically. They had Maury's notebook describing Kelmer by name and appearance. They had the necklace found in his possession. They had his journals documenting his obsession with women on trails. They had forensic evidence linking his truck to the burial site. And they had his own words from the interrogation, ambiguous but incriminating. She shouldn't have run.